Well, we have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that we said that at this point we were certain, since we didn't get any balance tuning last week, that we must have in the plans the balance tuning to come for this week, in this reset to be announced, and the good news is that we did. On Friday, as was expected, either Friday or Monday, is when we got our balance tuning. Now, what is the bad news? The bad news is that most of the balance tuning is disappointing. The balance tuning that is hitting many of the specs is rather irrelevant, and then some of the other specs in need of balance tuning have been pretty much ignored. But let's start first with the most important one, the biggest one of the changes, the more impactful one, which is the change to Beast Mastery Hunter. Because Beast Mastery Hunter gets its all damage increased by 4%. Now obviously already when you go and look at today's results in the raid, that is one of the specs we mentioned would have been in need of buffs. We mentioned Balance, Feral, Devastation, Augmentation, BM and Frost Mage. Pretty much just the ones at the bottom in the raid right now. It's not that hard to come to that conclusion in who do you want to see buffed in the raid. We did make some asterisks, like Feral was at the bottom, but not really because they were terrible in single target, for example, where they were doing much better, right? But in general, those were the specs you wanted to see buffed. So 4% flat to BM is decent already. If you look at their damage average, a 4% buff would bring them by default to 5.2 million average, which is still only here, right? So they wouldn't go up by that much. However, the buffs continue. And this is something that for a long time has been considered useless, because the buffs are that Death Blow, which is your kill command's chance to proc and give you Death Blow, basically to be able to use your kill shot, which obviously as Dark Ranger turns into Black Arrow, is now increased by default. It's no longer a 10% chance, it gets upped to a 20% chance. So every time you kill command, you have 1 chance in 5 to be able to use Black Arrow. Then, more importantly, the Bell Toll's damage bonus goes from 6% to 10%, so every time you use a Black Arrow, you gain 10% damage instead of 6% damage. The Phantom Pain damage share is now 45% instead of 30%. Phantom Pain is basically the splash damage. Every target with the Black Arrow dot on them gets splash damage, now increased to 45%, and then Bleak Powder does 25% more damage. And this one is the explosion, the AoE explosion around the target of the Black Arrow is also increased for BM. And this is very relevant because this pretty much turns Beast Mastery as now the default spec for Hunter. It now has the average highest damage in single target. It is now ahead of Marksmanship Dark Ranger, which was previously the default pick for single target. Now BM is above. Now for AoE, while the actual flat sim still shows Dark Ranger Beast Mastery below both Marksmanship and Pack Leader, Beast Mastery in actual simulated Mythic Plus sims, where you do combine both the single target and the AoE metrics as well as the prio damage on the main target to try to see how they would perform in Mythic Plus. So not just in front of 8 target dummies to check out their AoE, but trying to simulate their Mythic Plus performance. It has put Beast Mastery as now the better version of the Hunter specs in Mythic Plus, particularly, as you can see, thanks to their prio damage. You can see that the single target value of both Beast Mastery Pack Leader, Beast Mastery Dark Ranger are quite close to each other. The AoE values are also quite close to each other. The simulated MDT sim, so the Mythic Plus simulation, they're also close to each other. In fact, both the Dark Ranger and Pack Leader of BM are winning out, but the prio damage on the main target in AoE packs is much higher with the no multi-shot Beast Mastery Pack Leader version. So in short, with these changes, you have Beast Mastery now as the to-go choice in the raid for most of your fights, and then it is now a much better option in Mythic Plus, especially the no multi-shot version, which is a much higher prio damage in AoE at the cost of some weaker AoE overall. So your overall damage would be lower by playing that build. Now, in terms of other relevant buffs, you do have a rather minor one. Blood Decay gets its damage buffed by 6% and 10% more Bone Shield armor. It's rather irrelevant. What gets a bit more relevant is Balanced Druid. Now, this is a 5% damage increase to all of Balanced Druid. However, this is a very confusing buff, because they do buff Balanced Druid by 5%, but then they nerf Eluna's Chosen, which is the currently used hero talent of Balanced Druid. They nerf the 2-piece set bonus to give you 5% less Starfire damage. They give you 10% reduced damage on your Fury of Elune initial flash damage, and the minor moon damage has been reduced by 10% as well. So technically this for Eluna's Chosen builds is only a 2% damage increase. It's only a 5% damage increase for Keeper of the Grove. But Keeper of the Grove was already behind Eluna's Chosen and nobody was playing Keeper of the Grove. So this effectively puts this buff at being a much smaller buff for a Balanced Druid and much less impactful. Even the 5% buff would have moved Balanced Druid to still be one of the worst specs, just more in line with the rest of the bad ones rather than being at the very bottom. And now the buff is even smaller. So it is a very disappointing change for Balanced Druid because it's not nearly big enough to basically make a change. Now, what does make a change in terms of numbers, although I'm not sure by how much, is Augmentation, because Scale Commander bombardments are buffed by 25%. This one does make a change because Augmentation Evokers are playing Scale Commander. So this is a buff, a 3% buff in single target that does go and affect the hero talent they are currently playing. What instead is the complete opposite is Devastation, because you do get your Deep Breath damage increased by 20%, but more importantly, your Command Squadron, your 2-piece set bonus of your other Evokers that come and help you, they do 10% more Disintegrate damage. This does put Scale Commander much closer to Flame Shaper. The buffs have brought it close enough to Flame Shaper to make it even usable in pure single target fights like Plexus, Sentinel and Fractillus, but in fights where, for example, there are damage amps, the burst window of Flame Shaper still makes it easily the best choice for you in these fights. And you might even play it now on Soul Hunters because your 3-target, cleave disintegrate of Scale Commander is now even better, so it's possibly even playable on Soul Hunters. But for the higher level, essentially, for the harder bosses in the tier and for Mythic Plus keys, since Flame Shaper can utilize Firestorm much better than Scale Commander can, it is still not really an option. However, it is at least now not a complete loss to play Scale Commander instead of a Flame Shaper for Devastation. The last of the changes goes to healing. Discipline was the one we mentioned was lagging by far at the bottom of the results. So what they're getting is a 5% heal increase on their Atonement, and then they have gotten their Atonement slightly reduced in the raid, but compared to the flat heal increase of Atonement is still a buff for Mythic Plus. It's just not as big as the buff they're getting in the raid. The numbers are also much smaller than they actually sound, because it's not that Discipline heals only with Atonement. Even worse, the actually most used build right now of Discipline is Oracle, which heals even less with Atonement. So you get buffed by 5% in Atonement healing, but this is your Atonement healing, only 33% of your total healing. So it's an even smaller number. It makes sense though to get a slightly lesser buff in Mythic Plus, because in Mythic Plus Discipline was definitely doing better than currently how they are doing in the raid. Who also gets buffed, but not nearly in as important of a way, is Holy Priest, because they get their heal increased by 12%, their Halo increased by 40%, and then Archon Empowered Surges are going to increase the healing done of Flesh Heal by an extra 15%. Now, why is this sad? Well, it is sad because for starters, at the moment, Holy Priests are playing Oracle. They are not playing Archon. Most of the Oracle players are not even bothering talenting into Halo in the first place, so the 40% heal buff doesn't do much of anything for them. The buff to heal also doesn't mean much of anything because priests don't really cast heal anymore. This isn't Dragonflight. And then the buff to the hero talent, the Empower Surges in Archon, is also pointless. So basically for the current version of Holy Priest you have in the raid, this is nothing. It does nothing for you. Only if you swap to Archon and you start playing Archon, this has an actual buff effect. And at the moment, these buffs are not enough to make Archon better than Oracle anyways. So effectively, for now, these buffs are essentially in standby until Archon is playable over Oracle. These are all of the buffs we have gotten for today, which is why we mentioned it is somewhat disappointing. We have gotten the buffs to Balanced Druid, which were somewhat stunted by the fact that at the same time Anune's Chosen was also nerfed, so it was a buff but a smaller buff than it seems. Devastation was buffed in the hero talent they are not playing. Holy Priest was buffed in the hero talent they are not playing. Discipline was buffed overall, but the buff was very small, much too small compared to the current gap they have for other healers. Beast Mastery was buffed overall and in a hero talent that they weren't playing, but this one might have a good effect, or definitely had a good effect, because now this hero talent they weren't playing, Dark Ranger, has turned to be, after yet another round of buffs, currently the better one now. It's going to be the better one in the raid for pure single target, and it's also going to be a viable choice in AoE, in a Mythic Plus overall. That's where the second part of our statement of being somewhat disappointed is. We were expecting, first of all, larger buffs to these specs, touching their already played hero talents for starters, for balance, for devastation, for feral druid, for frost mage, more importantly for lacking and missing specs like assassination, like subtlety, like frost mage, like enhancement shaman. These specs have gone quite missing in this round of balance tuning. So yes, it is good that the balance tuning came. No, it wasn't particularly exciting or particularly good for the moment. So this is what we have on this Saturday when it comes to the balance tuning launched by Blizzard on this weekend for the next reset. But for today though, with this done and out of the way, we can now leave each other. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with of course everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I hate it when you go to sleep, you set the alarm, but the alarm doesn't ring and you wake up like 4 hours later.